Hi everyone, my name is Njenga Hakina. I am the Africa Climate Editor at the China Global South Project. Just before we get to today's podcast, I want to update you on the work we are doing at CGSP. While there is extensive news coverage on China's relations with the United States, Europe, and the current situation involving Taiwan, the same cannot be said for its interactions with developing countries, also referred to as the Global South. Unfortunately, there is a lack of comprehensive reporting in this area, and this is precisely where our team comes in. We have a dedicated group of editors who are in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and who diligently report on these stories in real time every day. Furthermore, we make it a point to provide our content in 3 languages. We have it in English, in French, and in Arabic. If you'd like to join our growing community of readers from around the world, go to China Global South /subscribe. And subscriptions start at just $19 a month. Once again, that's chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Thank you.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to be talking about Chinese infrastructure in Africa with a particular focus on the Kenyan Standard Railway. Now, this has been an issue that we have talked about going back at least a decade since we've been doing the show. In fact, I think this was one of the big first infrastructure projects that we covered way back when we started this podcast in the early 2010s. It is one of the showcase infrastructure projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in many ways stands apart from so many of the other BRI projects around the world merely because of the scale of what it was. So in many ways, it's the standard gauge railway in the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka that stand apart from the others as the high watermark of the Belt and Road. And you'll see from the time that these projects started to kind of, come online, that Chinese infrastructure spending started to go down quite a bit, not only in Africa, but around the world. And in part because the SGR stands as an example of some of the excesses of the Belt and Road. Now, interestingly, right now, Cobus, is we're starting to see the telling of the SGR story not from a Western perspective, which is largely focused on lending and loans. And in many cases, the narrative of the debt trap was shaped by the SGR, and we're going to talk about that. And at the same time, it's also been told by Chinese narratives. Global Times, Xinhua showing this as an example of Chinese infrastructure spending in Africa. But now more and more, we're starting to see a Kenyan voice emerge in all of this. And it's absolutely fascinating. And what you will hear in this new Kenyan voice that is emerging and telling the SGR story is a much more prominent focus on governance rather than on the role of the Chinese or others. There's a new documentary series that just came out from Africa Uncensored that I'd like to bring your attention to. And they've done 2 episodes now. It looks like they're going to do a bunch more, but they talk to all of the major players involved in the SGR story, and it's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to play a few of sound bites for you now just to try and set the stage for our conversation. I'm going to start with businessman and politician Jim Wanjinji, who back in 2021 claimed that the standard gauge railway was originally his idea. According to him, and then again, he is a very controversial politician, and you'll see on the YouTube comments on the Africa Uncensored video, a lot of people do not like Wanjinji. He's a very, very contentious guy, but he claims that had the project gone through his way, it would have cost just $389 billion to build rather than $3.8 billion that it cost for the China Road and Bridge Corporation to build it. He also said he would have taken the railway from the port of Mombasa all the way to the border with Uganda in the city of Malaba. And he claimed that rather than using outdated and costly diesel locomotives, he would have made the SGR electric.
Having played a key role in the construction of one of the country's largest infrastructure projects at the time, the Thika Superhighway, which cost Kenyans 32 billion shillings, Wanjigi was looking to extend his influence beyond the Kibaki regime into the Kenyatta regime, and had the ticket to do so. Another large infrastructure project.
That is a project I had begun in 2008, right? As a private project.
Yeah.
A PPP with China Road and Bridge. We put in proposals. And our proposal, after we did the technical, feasibility and technical studies, was that it was going to cost from Mombasa to Malaba about 55 billion at the time.
Yeah.
Right? And really, what we were doing is not doing the civil works you're seeing going up. It was going to be a track on the ground, but SGR track.
So Wanjigi's outline of what he said it was going to be very different than what actually happened. What actually came through was a $3.8 billion project that ended in the Rift Valley city of Naivasha, did not make it all the way to the border. Interestingly, now they're bringing the meter gauge railway from Uganda to Naivasha. So the dream of connecting the port of Mombasa to Uganda is coming true, just slowly and in a very different way than a lot of people thought it would. Now, this was at the time one of the largest, if not the largest, infrastructure projects in Kenyan history. And under Kenyan law, procurement contracts must be submitted for public review and they must be submitted to Parliament for review. However, Kimani Ichung'wah, who was the majority leader in Parliament at the time and vice chair of the Public Investment Committee that supposedly was supposed to do oversight of the government's borrowing and infrastructure spending, said he never saw the contract. His committee led an inquiry into the SGR contract and found a number of problems about how the project was procured with CRBC and the cost to build it. But the big problem, though, that Ichung'wah and none of his colleagues in Parliament ever got a chance to actually look at the contract. And the reason why is because that this was a government-to-government contract, and it's because of that the Supreme Court of Kenya, the High Court, said that it does not need to reveal that contract.
Have you actually laid eyes on the SGR contract?
Have you yourself?
I'm not in the Public Investment Committee.
I remember one of your colleagues in the media, I can't remember who it was, did ask that question to our former president, Uhuru Kenyatta. And he said within 2 weeks, he would release that contract. And I have never laid eyes on it myself.
And other regulators who were also tasked to provide oversight of the SGR contract were equally flustered. Edward Ouko, who was the Auditor General back then, expressed major concerns about the SGR deal, and Ouko also played another important role in this whole drama, as it was him who mistakenly suggested that the port of Mombasa, that is the actual physical port itself, was to be used as collateral in the deal if the Kenyan government could not repay the loans. This, of course, was not true. This was a misreading of the deal. A number of scholars, including Professor Deborah Browdegum at Johns Hopkins University, debunked that very, very clearly. And in fact, it was revenue from the Kenya Ports Authority that ran the port of Mombasa that was used as collateral, not the port itself. Nonetheless, the message got out, and that fueled a lot of misunderstanding. And you'll hear from Ouko how it speaks to the problems that an otherwise well-regarded regulator like him had in supervising this deal.
This thing was really a one-sided thing. It was packaged, brought, and we accepted. Okay? Ironically, I made a report once about potential contingent liability on the assets of Kenya Ports Authority, and I was told, I was really criticized.
Just 1 year after Kenya took a $3.8 billion loan to finance a railway whose economics were shaky at best.
So, Cobus, there we have it, the story from some of the principals who were involved in this. The focus, again, not on the Chinese here, but the focus much more on lapses in oversight and governance.
Yes, I think you mentioned at the beginning that the SGR has become this emblematic Belt and Road project. And I think in a lot of ways, it's become also this, it's kind of like area of radical uncertainty around the interaction between different Chinese entities and different African entities. It seems to kind of like pull into itself a lot of the kind of like various kind of problematic dynamics between these different entities, but it also just keeps raising questions. And a key question for me is what was going on in the decision making within the government around the project, and so corruption obviously plays a big role there, but there seems to also be a lot of questions there that need to be unpacked also in relation to the interactions between different Chinese entities and different African entities and how they actually came together and how these decisions were made. So and that then raises a lot of other questions about the Belt and Road itself, I think.
Well, that's a great transition to our discussion today, looking at the role of African agency and Kenyan agency specifically in the SGR. There's a new paper that came out earlier this year, Improvised Hybridity in the Fixing, quote unquote, of Chinese Infrastructure Capital, the Case of Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway. That's an article that was published in the academic journal Antipodes, and it was also featured in The Conversation, written by Gediminas Lesoutis, who's a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Amsterdam, and an independent researcher, Huangjung Li. Thank you both for joining us. Gedis and Zheng Li, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Congratulations on the article. Absolutely fascinating. The timing couldn't be better, again, as there is this evaluation and this history-making of what happened in this landmark infrastructure project that in many ways has brought great benefit to Kenyans, as there is now a proper functioning railway that's delivering millions of tons of cargo, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. But again, it was controversial at its origin. Zheng Li, let's talk to you a little bit just to say, how did you get started with this project in looking at how mega infrastructure projects are realized in African countries and why you chose to focus on the SGR in particular?
Thank you very much, Eric. I started as a postdoc researcher in the University of Sheffield in the UK when my PI, the project, my sort of boss and I are doing the project on infrastructure investment by the Chinese government in Ethiopia and Uganda. And one of the focus that we were looking at was the Ethiopian-Djibouti railway. So to make a comparison, the Kenyan SGR made a great reference with that. So I started looking at the SGR because it's also 2017 is about the year that the first phase of the SGR started running. And also then later on, I think it was Gedis who sort of found me and we started to collaborate on this research that made the article that we published together.
Gedis, I read several accounts of the SGR over the years, and they tend to be quite like top down. They tend to focus on the loans, on the kind of government-to-government relationship and so on. But the paper is somewhat different in the sense that it has a lot of interviews and a lot of kind of key stakeholders being interviewed. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the research process.
Absolutely. So I have been working on large-scale infrastructures in Kenya for 5 years now, and I started doing that. Then I was at the University of Cambridge, and part of my research was, the main point of my research was not so much Chinese engagement in infrastructure development, but its impacts and effects across different landscapes of Kenya. So I was interested in learning and studying more how these projects that are officially supposed to bring development prosperity actually unfold on the ground and how they affect different groups of people in Kenya. And by the time I approached Zheng Li, I had done over 8 months of fieldwork in Kenya talking to different stakeholders, including representatives of the government, civil society groups, and different populations that were differently affected by the construction of the railway. Either people who had been displaced and not compensated, or people who had been resettled and received sizable financial compensations for the land that was accrued for the development of the project. So in that time, I amassed quite a large data set, essentially, of different kind of insights, perspectives, and experiences of these large-scale projects in Kenya. And I eventually ended up approaching Zheng Li because, well, I realized that if I want to understand the complexity of these projects, I do have to engage with a Chinese contractor to see how they see this and how they engage with different social contestations that happen on the ground as forms of contestation, both of the governance practices in Kenya, but also how these projects are implemented on the ground by Chinese actors.
So maybe we can ask both of you to give us the top line of your findings from that research and you could talk about the data sets that you picked up from your interviews in Kenya, and then maybe Zheng Li to talk a little bit about some of your findings of what Chinese contractors were saying, and then we can start our deep dive there. So since we just heard from you, let's hear what you were saying in terms of what are some of the key takeaways that people can learn from all of those conversations that you had about the different stakeholders involved in the SGR.
Absolutely. So I think, at this point, I think one of the main theme that unites all the papers that I have written on the SGR and other large-scale infrastructures in Kenya is that the way they unfold, and I realized on the ground, this process is not linear. It's not necessarily controlled by either Chinese contractors or the Kenyan government, but it is a very multifaceted process that is influenced by different actors depending on their class, interests, and socioeconomic agendas that they have in terms of advancing their class position in Kenya and beyond Kenya. So I think that's kind of one theme that unites my writing on the SGR.
Yeah. Zheng Li, what about what you found? What's the overview of your research on the role of Chinese state-owned enterprises in places like Kenya and a company like the China Road and Bridge Corporation?
Yeah, so I think our article that was published on Antipode was very much taking the perspective of the Chinese stakeholders, especially the China Road and Bridge Corporation, the contractor, plus the operator. And one thing that we wanted to emphasize in the paper was that even though it's a Chinese-funded, Chinese-constructed project, in Kenya, what is often neglected in a lot of the debates about Chinese investment in infrastructure in Africa is the diversity of the Chinese actors and diversity of the Chinese, even the state-owned enterprises themselves, so which are led by different kinds of interests and could make a very different impact on the company's decisions as well as the project's implementation.
So an article that you guys wrote for The Conversation, following the publication of the paper, you write that China Road and Bridge Corporation constantly shifted its strategies in dealing with the SGR process. So Zheng Li, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how did they shift their strategies and what were they trying to achieve?
Yeah, so it's the focus of an article, and it's a very complicated story, and it's very hard to bring it very short narrative. But one thing that we saw through the SGR project was that the narratives of the project itself has changed several times. So when it came, like the video that you showed before, Eric, it was claimed by a businessman plus politician in Kenya as a private or PPP project. But now it's frequently used as a flagship project for BRI. But we all know that the coining of BRI actually came after a lot of the decisions were made already in the Kenyan standard gauge railway project. So it's a very interesting thing that we are seeing now, the Kenyan standard gauge railway is being used as a flagship project for BRI.
So they kind of backed it into the BRI a little bit.
Well, we sort of argue in the article that BRI is not something that has a very clear, let's say, project-oriented steps to follow kind of guidance. It's more of an overarching idea that promotes the exportation of the Chinese technology and the exportation of Chinese companies and capitals. But SGR, in a way, it should be viewed as a negotiation process between a Chinese enterprise and different actors in Kenya themselves. So at the project level, it is a very dynamic and shifting, process, just as any large-scale infrastructure in the world.
So Geddes, let's talk about that shifting narrative. So the Chinese were adapting to the realities of the BRI, also adapting to accusations of predatory lending and the debt trap issues over the port of Mombasa. What was happening on the Kenyan side in terms of the shifting narrative? Because Uhuru Kenyatta, then the president at the time, came in saying He wanted to modernize. He started borrowing big. He started running into problems, particularly in Parliament, when the bills started coming forward. And also there were accusations of labor abuse, mismanagement, delay, all these different things that forced a reaction on the Kenyan side. So Zhengli kind of talked about the shifting narratives on the Chinese side. What did you find on the Kenyan side in terms of the evolving narratives?
These projects, initially, when they are conceptualized and presented as these opportunities of development, they very much function as political currency for high-level politicians who choose to do that. And in Kenya, I think it's pretty much public knowledge that SGR, Thika Railway, Lapset, Lamu Port, all these projects are legacy projects of the presidential office that is serving at the time. But of course, then projects run into inevitable problems that could be prevented from the start, but they are not deliberately. For instance, environmental and social impact assessment, whilst it's a legal requirement in Kenya, enshrined in constitution, it is overly not carried out in a proper form due to the lack of political will to support it. So when these problems occur because civil society starts raising these concerns, then of course one kind of strategically useful thing for the Kenyan political elites to do is to shift the blame onto the Chinese side of things. And it very much kind of feeds into the Western discourses of Chinese neocolonialism. But these are kind of too easy an explanations to explain the actual complex reality and the political currencies of these projects that function and exist on the ground.
Right. So that's the political discourse rather than the realities.
Absolutely. In terms of this kind of Chinese neocolonialism, that's very much a product of diminishing power of the US and anxiety and trying to kind of portray these things in these geopolitically anxious terms rather than engaging with the actual reality, what happens on the ground. I think one interesting thing that came out of our research that Zhengli and I did, and I also did on my own, is that I think there's this perception that Beijing and then Chinese companies, they do as they please on the ground and they can impose their rules of conduct. But that's very much not the case in the context of Kenya, not only because of the vested interests of Kenyan political elite in these projects, but also how people themselves on the ground who live in and around infrastructure projects mobilize themselves to challenge, for instance, a contractor that's working on the ground. So, for instance, one thing that people do when they are not happy with how projects are implemented, they can block access roads for the contractor to access construction sites and do those kind of everyday modes of resistance that then forces the contractor to engage with them directly and try to negotiate corporate social responsibility strategies. And that's what we see what happened alongside the second phase of the railway, Nairobi to Naivasha, where the contractor, rather than relying on the Kenyan government to sort out compensation processes, started engaging with individual landowners directly on case-by-case basis to negotiate land lease so they could implement the project on time. Then, of course, it opens this another dynamic that is that the question can be asked, is this a form of kind of interference in the sovereign matters of the country, whether rather than the Kenyan government, it's a Chinese contractor that is engaging in kind of land transfers and compensations. So again, I think this shows that it's never just one-sided story. There's always a lot of nuance and complex details to these issues.
And Zhengli, just following on that story of the land acquisition, how does this fit into the larger kind of dynamic of China Road and Bridge Corporation continually pivoting and adapting their approach? In the paper, you focus on what's called the early entry scheme in relation to land acquisition. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit what that is and what role CRBC played in the land acquisition process, which later proved quite controversial.
Yes, so it's actually a very interesting term that was mentioned by one of the interviewees. I think by when Geddes was interviewing some of the officials in the Nairobi Authority, they came up with this term, early entry scheme, which, by the way, was never mentioned by the CRBC themselves, because it's an initiation by the company in order to accelerate the implementation of the project, because for one thing, they think the on-time delivery is a very important issue for the reputation for both the company itself and for a state project like this. A second issue is that it's not common, so they had to be very careful with it. It's not common because usually in an international bidding process, the contractor's responsibility starts when National Land Commission delivers the land. So when the land ownership is collected and the land is available for the contractors to enter the site, that's when the responsibility of the contractor begins. But in the case of the SGR, the specificity lies in that the China Road and Bridge is not only a commercial contractor, it's also an agent between the bank who is providing the loan for the project, which is the Exim Bank in China, and the project itself. So there's kind of this ambiguous role played by the state-owned enterprise of CRBC. So they are sort of trapped in between the political and economic interests of this project itself. So on the one hand, they have to deliver a project on time with good quality. On the other, they have to fulfill the sort of economic goal of the project, which is by the company, which is making a return.
It's fascinating that you're talking about how CRBC and other Chinese state-owned enterprise are constantly adapting to the environment that they're in. And listening to what Geddes was saying about how this, again, the stakeholder engagement by the local authorities wasn't there, so CRBC stepped in there as well. And I guess this is some of the difficulty that people have in understanding the role and responsibility of a contractor. Many people think that CRBC is just a builder. That's what they do. They put down cement, they put rail ties down, and they train people, and off you go. But what you're saying is they're playing this role as CSR consultant. They're implementing policies on the ground at the same time as being the go-between with the finance ministry and the Exim Bank, and the primary interface with the government itself. So they're playing a much more expansive role in these projects than just a builder or a contractor. And I guess that's part of the reason why there may be misunderstanding about the role that Chinese contractors like CRBC actually have, because they're unlike Bechtel or Moto Engel from Portugal, who are just traditional contractors. Do other contractors from other countries play these same roles, or is this something exceptional to the Chinese?
I wouldn't say that I have the capacity to evaluate because we haven't done any comparative studies, but I would definitely say that it's related to the very interesting role that the Chinese SOEs are playing, because they are, viewed in the perspective of the international or the global infrastructure market. They are definitely a very commercial player, but at the same time, based on or grounded in the special political economy in China, state-owned enterprises has its own burden when it plays out its economic interests in the global market. So somehow this kind of contradictory role of the CRBC is embedded in its ambiguous status functioning as a state-owned enterprise in China. And I have to say that this brings us back to the thing that we mentioned, that actually BRI was coined after the SGR. A lot of negotiations on the SGR have finished. I believe the story was told that when CRBC approached the Kenyan government or whoever brought these two parties together to start talking on the project, CRBC came very much as a traditional contractor to approach a contracting sort of entity in order to secure future business deals. So I think that's how their role started. But by including SGR as a BRI project, then it somehow it basically gives another title to the SGR, which then also entitled the role of the CRBC in the project, a very complicated situation.
Geddes, do you have anything to add in terms of the role of the Chinese contractors and how really in many ways adaptable they are to these different roles that they were supposed to play, and why that generates confusion to outsiders looking to understand who they are?
Absolutely. I think to answer that question, I would comment not so much on the Chinese actors, but on the very political economy of post-colonial Kenyan state and how Kenyan state functions in itself. Meaning that, when we think about Kenya's history and when, it came into being as an independent state, it was only very recently in 1963. And the political settlement is very much characterized by different levels of conflict, class conflict, political elite conflict, ethnic conflict. And so what happens there, and this is not specific to Kenya alone, this is kind of generally characterized as post-colonial state in Africa more generally, is that the states are both strong in pushing certain political economics agendas, like, for instance, large-scale projects, infrastructures. But at the same time, those states are weak and fragile because in certain areas outside of the capital, they might not necessarily have a strong political influence because the state, well, is kind of, due to its very kind of post-colonial character and context, is weak in that context. So we see, for instance, in Kenya, there was a devolution reform trying to decentralize Kenyan state apparatus and kind of bring state authority to different parts of Kenya through this kind of institutional administrative restructuring. And my point is that to engage in this very kind of contradictory, complex context of state power and fragility, any outside actor who enters this context has to negotiate certain levels of power, how they have to adhere to official standards, laws, and regulations, but at the same time, they have to engage with actors who have actual political power on the ground in terms of patron-client relationship networks. So I would say that the way Chinese actors play is not only specific to them, but any outside actor who would engage in that context, that's what they would have to do. They would have to negotiate with different actors to advance their agendas, if that makes sense.
So, Geddes, kind of following up on that, like over the last few years in Africa-China studies, there's been what a lot of people have called the African agency turn. So there's a strong focus on how different African actors are engaging with Chinese entities. So some of this work that you mentioned, for example, these different kinds of elites that are involved, and also the ground up, resistance to some of the projects. I've seen other, kind of other examples of similar kind of dynamics also being characterized as expressions of African agency. But I was wondering how through having gone through all this research process, like where do you locate this particular work and the complexities that you're uncovering in this wider debate about African agency in relation to Chinese power? And how do you think that African agency debate needs to shift to make it more realistic or more nuanced?
I think one thing that we ought to be careful about is not to fetishize and romanticize African agency. In these structural dynamics of global capitalism, state capitalism, and global movement of, spatial fix of Chinese state capital and how it's being exported overseas to enhance capital accumulation in China and beyond. So whilst African governments, civil society, populations have an important role to play, because they are not helpless actors. They very much have power to contest and challenge these processes to advance their specific class socioeconomic interests. At the same time, there's a structural limit to what can be done and what can be achieved. And one of the bottom lines that we acknowledge in the paper, I think at the very conclusion, what we say is that in spite of this complexity, hybridity, and different actions and interests that Chinese companies represent and how they have to negotiate on the ground, they still structurally advance the power of Chinese state capital in Kenya. And I think it's important to acknowledge this kind of structural dynamics as well, saying who wins in the end, because there are very clear winners and losers in the process. And so, in other words, in spite of acknowledging this complexity, I think we still need to say who these processes overly benefit and who they disadvantage. And here I would say that they still benefit Chinese financial elites and different state-owned enterprises who do make some, very clear gains in their activities in Africa.
Zhongli, Geddes talks about the winners and losers looking back on the standard gauge railway project. We opened the show with the Africa Uncensored sound bites from various stakeholders in it who clearly saw there were some governance challenges. As you look back now on this project, it was a landmark project, and we may never see a project that large in Africa ever again financed by the Chinese. But what's your reflection? What's your takeaway when you think about the legacy of the standard gauge railway project in Kenya?
Yes, thank you. Geddes mentioned the clear winners and losers debates. I think that's part of the article that is still open to debate. The reason that I'm not so up to the winner-loser kind of framework is that I think it's a learning curve for, let's say, all the actors. because it's something that is not based on a very mature kind of international development model. And we have seen that the loan from Exim Bank and other policy banks from China in the international market has been growing since about 2008, 2007, 2008, especially after the financial crisis in Asia. But then it had a drop after 2016. So there was a very obvious learning curve for all the actors in China, including, let's say, the financial actors as well as the contracting bodies, to see what roles they play in the international market, what kind of products they could offer in the global market of infrastructure development, and most importantly, whether the kind of successful model of development, which is highly relying on investment in public infrastructure, would apply in other contexts. And that's one thing I think for a lot of the infrastructure developers and contractors learned in the 1 decade or even more kind of practice in the emerging market, is that they can't take it for granted that investment in infrastructure would naturally lead to growth. There's so much complex in that. And what has happened in China in the past 3 or 4 decades, which is based on infrastructure projects-led growth in urban areas, relies on a lot more condition than public investment in infrastructure. What we have seen in the SGR, for example, is that when this kind of development idea is put into a different context where the power structure is very different between state and local authority, and there are much more complex stakeholder relations between the civil society, the local authority, and the national elites, the state elites, whether heavy infrastructure investment would naturally lead to growth is something that we have to carefully debate and also calculate.
Yeah, Kenya is going to be a fascinating case study for that. Does infrastructure lead to growth? Kenyan economist David Ndii wrote a paper for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace who said, no, it doesn't. And in fact, that Kenya should have spent the money it spent on the SGR on human development initiatives like education and also even rural development would have been a much better spend. In fact, David Ndii then compared to what happens in Southeast Asia where I live, where in fact they focus less on infrastructure and more on agrarian and education and women and girls education specifically. So very interesting points there, Zhengli. Geddes, we're going to give you the last word. Give us the legacy and the takeaways from this mammoth project that in many ways has been transformative in Kenya, both for better and for worse.
That's quite a task you have given me. I mean, the way I study this project and the way I see it, that it very much exposes the internal contradictions and divisions in Kenyan state and society, that it enhances, at times it can function as political currency, political elites, but on the ground, rather than bringing development and prosperity, it enhances and further exaggerates pre-existing social and economic inequalities. And that's how these projects, to my view, need to be understood in Kenyan context.
Okay. Gediminas Lasutis is a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Amsterdam, and Huang Zhengli is an independent researcher. They together wrote a fascinating academic paper and a shorter, more condensed conversation article. If you really want to do the deep dive, you can go to Antipode. I think I might have said it wrong at the beginning of the show. Antipode is how you say it, right, guys?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies to everybody at Antipode for missing that one. I loved it. It was a radical journal of geography. So the word radical in that was, to me, was a lot of fun. Improvised hybridity in the fixing of Chinese infrastructure capital, the case of Kenya's standard gauge railway. Again, it sounds a little bit academic-y. Don't be afraid. It's really accessible and absolutely fascinating. And you would be reading this at a time when the history of the SGR is now being told. And this is why it's important to have these conversations. But if that bigger academic article is a little bit too much for you to bite off, they do have a shorter one, China and Africa. Kenya Railway Study shows investment projects aren't a one-way street. I'm going to put links to both of them in the show notes so you guys can check them out. Geddes, Zhengli, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And thank you for a wonderful paper.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here.
Cobus, between this paper and the Africa Uncensored documentary, I have to tell you, I am just so happy now that the discussion about the SGR is finally moving away from the stupid, idiotic, moronic basic, simplistic, reductionist discussion that we've had for the past 10 years about this project. There is so much complexity and nuance that is overwhelmed by this debt trap narrative, the predatory lending discussions that have really shaped the discussion about the SGR for so many years. And this question of African agency. And I think Geddes' point that there's a fetishization of African agency in many parts of the US and Europe and external actors that also eliminate the discussion of accountability. And I think what the Africa Uncensored documentary did was focus on the question of accountability. And that is part of agency as well. So I was very, very happy, both, again, with the Africa Uncensored documentary and this paper, that we're getting into something that is far more interesting and complex and contradictory than what we've heard for the past 10 years.
Absolutely. I mean, this fetishization of African agency, I think, is a really big problem because it also is very easy to geopoliticize. I have seen instances in the past where, and this comes from all sides, it's not particularly only Western sides, but I did see it particularly from Western commentators, where if an African actor, whether that's a community or a government, resists China, that's seen as an expression of agency. If they work with China, that's seen as being co-opted or being brainwashed or whatever. So the choice to work with China or with different Chinese entities is, of course, also an expression of agency. But that's not where the story ends. There's many ways of expressing agency, some worse than others. And being massively corrupt is definitely an expression of agency, but not a good one. So that kind of like being called to task by other African stakeholders about the choices that were made is a really important kind of part of this process. What I'm very interested in is to see is what the kind of longer fallout is going to be, in Kenya and elsewhere. Because I think to a large extent, the standard gauge railway in its complexity and in its massive cost overruns and in its, huge, complicated and problematic deals, in some ways, I think, burnt everyone, so to a certain extent, because of their standard gauge railway, there won't be any further standard gauge railways. There won't be any similar kind of big projects because it's now become this kind of cautionary example of how you're not supposed to do business. And in the process, it then ends up, I think unfairly in many cases, kind of just adding to this kind of false narrative of inflated African risk, which means that African countries find it harder to borrow, they find it harder to get international contractors to work there, etc., etc. It ends up kind of snowballing into a set of narratives that aren't necessarily realistic. So it's kind of unpacking them, and particularly unpacking the African side of it, is really important.
It's interesting that when you live in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese are building railways all over the place, the Indonesia high-speed railway just launched this year between, I think it's Jakarta and Bandung. There is also the Thailand high-speed railway. There's the Laos high-speed railway. How the discourse is so different in Africa than it is in Southeast Asia. In many ways, the similarities are there between what happened in Indonesia and Kenya. Cost overruns, poor social responsibility, very fluid role of the Chinese contractor, the state looking the other way, problematic land acquisition, but it played out in such a different way. And it didn't receive anywhere near the attention that the Kenyan project did. And I think that's another burden that Africa faces.
And it's also, interestingly for me, it's not becoming this kind of referendum on the African state or referendum on a particular, or on African governments or a particular kind of African government in the same way that the standard gauge railway does. I mean, there's the Jakarta-Bandung railway is problematic in a lot of ways, like really complicated, like unhappy kind of tendering process, like lots of problems. But in some ways, it doesn't become this, it's like from within Indonesia, as far as I can see, and also from outside, it doesn't become this kind of litmus test of, should these countries work with China, or should they, about their kind of development choices in the same way that it does in Africa. There is this kind of underlying, continuing kind of undermining of African decision-making or African choices, that kind of underlies this debate that I think deserves more unpacking, even as we're also seeing how problematic some of those choices are.
Well, to your point about the long-term impact of the SGR, and I think, and this is just my amateur outside view of this, I think it had a very chilling effect on whether China Exim Bank was going to finance other large-scale railway projects in Africa. And it's in Nigeria in particular where a number of railway projects, standard gauge as well, were put on ice, and the Chinese backed away from it. Now, there's no way for us to know if there was causality between what happened in Kenya and the fact that they backed away from the Nigerian railways, but it's to your sense and what you were saying about this perception of risk. And it was such a mess for the Chinese in Kenya that they just said, you know what? We're done with these big multi-billion-dollar projects in Africa. So now we've come into the small or beautiful project phase, which we've talked about on previous shows. And I have to think that there is some connection with the experience that the Chinese went through in Kenya, not exclusively in Kenya, but part of it just saying the complexity of these projects, the reputational risk, in terms of the financial risks also are there. You know what? Forget it. Let's go down into small-scale financing. And this is where we are. Interestingly, Cobus, it's the United States now that wants to step up into the railway building business. So they're putting forward up to $250 million in Angola for the Lobito corridor. That's going to be an upgrade in partnership with Moto Engel, Portugal, to rebuild this 1,067-kilometer Benguela railway. So it'll be interesting to see what the dynamics are of that project in comparison to what we saw in Kenya.
Yeah, well, it'll be very interesting. I mean,
you're not going to hear any predatory lending accusations coming out of Washington think tanks, though.
Certainly no accusations from Washington. Yeah, whether there's predatory lending, that's a different question. But we won't hear any accusations. I have to admit, I'll believe that railway when I see it. It's, who knows, but we'll see.
Well, that's with all U.S. projects. I mean, frankly, remember that MOU between Zambia, DRC, and the U.S. about battery building? Where's that? I mean, the U.S. is great at delivering these promises.
Yeah, I mean, instead they're going for simple old school extraction, like raw ore being pumped out of the continent, no refining at all.
And this is very funny because I had a number of conversations in Washington and I was telling them, I'm like, listen, guys, I don't know if I would be too proud about this project on the Lobito corridor. I mean, they're really excited that we're finally getting traction on this. And I'm like, building a railway from a mine to a port is not exactly innovative in an African context.
No, it repeats certain patterns.
400 or 500-year-old certain patterns.
Exactly, and patterns that Western observers are very quick to criticize when it's Chinese people building, kind of port mine connections. Then it's kind of neocolonialism left and right. When it's Western countries doing it, that's development, so. But I think the largest story of the SGR, as you say, is that, it kind of became this kind of cautionary tale. And for that, I think we'll always have to blame the particular Kenyan officials who were responsible for it. They will always carry this kind of historical guilt. They deserve condemnation for how they ruined it for the rest of the continent, I think.
They have deserved condemnation not only for what they've done to other African countries, but also to how they perverted their own legal system. Remember that it was a pair of young people in Mombasa who brought the court case to the High Court of Mombasa to try and force the government to release the contract. The government hemmed and hawed. Remember, we had this list of excuses from various ministers who said it was security, who said it was, I forget what they were, one after another. They were desperate to find a reason not to release this contract. Now, they released part of the contract, but they didn't release the important part of the contract. And I think, and it's interesting that Ruto, by the way, when he was running for president, said he would release the contract. Okay? And that never happened. My suspicion is that when you lift up the rock that is this contract, there's going to be a lot of bugs underneath it. And a lot of people stuff their pockets with money on this one. And even Ruto and his allies don't want to have that revealed. So the High Court sided with the State House and said because this is a government-to-government contract, it doesn't need to be released to the public. That is complete and total BS. The Kenyan public has a right to know what was in this contract, that they are now being forced to pay higher taxes to repay these loans. And these higher taxes are the cause of considerable social instability now in many parts of Kenya. So the fact that they don't know what happened is shameful. Absolutely shameful. And we all have a stake in all of this because the IMF is part of this discussion as well in terms of debt-distressed countries. And that's all of our tax money. So this is a socialized problem in many respects. So what happens in Kenya doesn't only stay in Kenya. And I just think, to your point, it is shameful. And we've watched a number of Kenyan civil society actors, from the media to these activists who brought the case in Mombasa, and they deserve an enormous amount of praise for what they've done to showcase and to highlight some of the shortcomings in the system. And kudos, by the way, to Africa Uncensored. If you have not watched these videos, you must. You absolutely must. They are fantastic. And again, it's the Kenyan telling of the story, not Westerners, Chinese, or other foreigners, or even other Africans. And you're going to hear a lot of nuance in the way they tell the story. Again, I'll put the links to those videos also in the show notes as well. So let's leave the conversation there. Great to return to the SGR as a story. We haven't talked about it in a while. Zhengli and Geddes did a fantastic report, and I'm so glad that we were able to get them on the show to share their insights with you guys. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the show. If you're interested in the SGR, in all these issues that we've talked about today, really, you want to check out the work that Cobus and the rest of the team are doing in covering China and Africa and China and the Global South every single day. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Try it out for 30 days for free. By the way, we have half-off discounts for students and teachers, just $10 a month for students and teachers. So if you want to get that discount, send me an email on your academic email address to eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll be happy to send you the links for that. So for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.